Welcome back to the DepDiv podcast. It is February 7th, 2026. If you spent your morning staring at your high school diploma and wondering why they taught you the Pythagorean theorem but not how to do your own taxes, or why you can identify a cell membrane but can't negotiate a lease, congratulations, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Maple, and today we're diving into a topic that is basically the ultimate old man shouts at cloud. Except the old man is an economist with a PhD from Chicago, and the cloud is the entire American public school system. We're talking about Thomas Sowell. Why? Because while normal people are busy arguing over whether 2026 is the year of the Linux desktop, we're out here wondering if we've all been brainwashed since kindergarten. Let's get into the propaganda of it all. So, Thomas Sowell. The man is essentially the final boss of facts don't care about your feelings. And this quote right here, this is his big argument, the one he's been hammering home since before most of us were born. He basically argues that American education has turned into this giant, tax-funded factory for propaganda rather than, actually teaching kids how to think. It's a spicy take that makes people very uncomfortable at dinner parties, which is exactly why we're talking about it. But where does a critique this intense even come from? Well, to really get it, you have to understand the man himself. Sowell's own life was shaped, and frankly, scarred, by the very educational problems he'd spent his life analyzing. His personal story is the key to his entire worldview. Okay, so picture this. You're a kid. You are a top student back home in the segregated South. Then your family moves to Harlem, and suddenly you're not just struggling, you're the worst kid in the class. That was Thomas Sowell. He couldn't keep up. He even talks about crying over his homework because he was just that lost. Now get this. It took him a year and a half of just grinding away to finally catch up. But here's the twist. Years later, he's a researcher, and he digs up the old school records. He finds out the average IQ in that school was just 84, and that was his light bulb moment. His struggle wasn't because he wasn't smart, it was because the educational gap was just that massive. And that experience really became the foundation for this belief. Raw talent, even for a guy who would go on to get degrees from Harvard and Chicago, is basically useless without good teachers and a system like actually works. You can have all the potential in the world, but if the system fails you, you're stuck. So he takes that personal lesson and puts on his economist hat. He starts looking at the public education system not just as a school, but as a business. And what he concludes is that it's a business designed to fail because it's missing one absolutely critical component. Think about it this way. If you open a restaurant and the food is terrible, people stop coming, you lose money, and you go out of business. That's a feedback loop. But public schools, they're funded by taxpayers, an almost endless stream of money. Sowell argues this means they can keep using failing methods for decades, even generations, because there are no real consequences for getting it wrong. The system just keeps on going. He often brings up his mentor, the economist Milton Friedman, to make this point. Losses are crucial. They're the universe screaming at you to stop doing what you're doing. But if you're insulated from loss, you never have to change. And according to Sowell, that's when an institution stops serving its students and starts serving itself, its bureaucracy, its unions, its own interests. But Sowell's whole thing isn't just about pointing out what's broken. He also points to what has worked. He talks about this lost history of Black educational excellence that's been almost completely wiped from the narrative. And the prime example is one incredible school. Meet Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. From 1870 to 1955, this all-Black school was a legit academic powerhouse. In 1899, its students were already outscoring kids in white schools on citywide tests. Most of its graduates went on to college, which was almost unheard of back then. And the alumni list? We're talking the first Black general, the first Black cabinet member, just an unbelievable record of success. But after the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, the school's model was changed, and its performance completely fell off a cliff. For Sowell, this is Exhibit A, that a model for success existed, and it was dismantled. And here's the part that is just dripping with irony. The whole legal argument behind Brown v. Board of Education was that separate schools were inherently unequal. But Dunbar, this shining example of a separate school that was actually superior, was literally a short walk away from the Supreme Court that basically said a school like it couldn't exist. The mind boggles. Okay, so let's bring this story into the present. Sowell argues this same pattern, ignoring what works, is happening right now with charter schools. But hold that thought. Time for a quick critical thinking break. Look, unlike the Department of Education, I actually value your feedback. I don't have a giant bureaucracy to protect me from your bad reviews, so I have to earn your love. If you're enjoying this deep dive into why we might all be products of a very expensive social experiment, do me a solid. Smash that subscribe button. Leave a 5-star review. Write something like, Sowell would probably hate this host's hair, but the stats were solid. It confuses the algorithms, triggers the SEO, and ensures that my charter podcast stays at the top of your feed. Do it now before someone tries to equity your subscription away. All right, so charter schools. In his research, Sowell zooms in on these schools in New York City, many of which are in the same building, drawing from the same neighborhood, and teaching the same curriculum as a public school. And the results? They're staggering. You have charter networks where math proficiency rates are hitting 98%, while the district school down the hall is struggling to get to 40%. The charter school kids aren't just doing better than their peers, they're often outscoring kids in wealthy white suburbs. So this gets to the core of Sowell's frustration. You'd think everyone would be cheering for this, right? Here you have schools creating actual, measurable equality of results. But instead, they're constantly under attack. Sowell argues it's because they threaten the established system. And for him, that's a tragic case of politics getting in the way of what's best for kids. Okay, last big idea, and this one's a doozy. We're moving from K-12 to higher education, and Sowell's critique of affirmative action. He argues that this well-meaning policy can actually be incredibly destructive, thanks to something he calls the mismatch effect. Here's how it works. You take a really smart, perfectly qualified student, but instead of sending them to a great school where they'd be a top performer, you put them in an ultra-elite school where the academic pace is set by students who are just on another level preparation-wise. The result? That very smart student struggles, falls to the bottom of the class, and might even drop out. Not because they aren't brilliant, but because they were put in a race they weren't prepared to run. And Sowell saw this happen right in front of him when he was a professor at Cornell. The university brought in a new class of Black students under affirmative action. Now, these were very bright kids, scoring at the 75th percentile nationally. But the average student at Cornell was already at the 99th percentile. The academic gap was huge, and the result was a catastrophe. Half of those bright, promising students ended up on academic probation. And that leads to this absolutely devastating conclusion from Sowell. He argues that these students, who would have been stars at hundreds of other excellent universities, were instead put in a situation that set them up for failure. The policy, in his view, didn't create opportunity. It created an experience of inadequacy and resentment. So there you have it, Thomas Sowell, the man who thinks your degree is probably just a very expensive participation trophy and that your family is more important than your congressman. From Dunbar High to modern charter schools, he keeps asking this one nagging question. If we have proof of what works, why do we fight it? Why do we protect failing systems and let them continue for generations? It's a lot to process, so feel free to go read a book that doesn't have pictures in it. This episode was produced by the legendary FireflyHaku. I'm convinced Haku is the only reason this podcast doesn't fall into the failing institution category. Haku manages the audio levels with more precision than a Sowell statistical chart, while I just provide the chaotic, sarcastic nerd energy. And now, an important announcement. Our fearless producer, FireflyHaku, is taking a well-deserved break. He's heading to Japan for a month-long skiing vacation. Apparently, he needs to exchange the heat of my rants for the cold of the Niseko slopes. He has worked tirelessly to keep this show from sounding like a garbled Zoom call, and he truly deserves the rest. So the deep dive will be going dark for about a month. No new episodes until Haku returns from his mountain-conquering, ramen-eating quest. Please be patient with us. We'll be back with more sarcasm, more deep dives, and hopefully a producer who doesn't have a broken leg from a Japanese redwood. Thanks for hanging out in my ear space today. Go out there, take some personal responsibility for your own entertainment while we're away, and try not to get brainwashed before we get back. Stay skeptical.